Okay, well, welcome to the workshop, Sacred Resistance. And I'd like to introduce the Reverend Rachel Pryor, who's going to get things started this afternoon. Rachel?
Sorry, I clicked leave instead of unmute, so hopefully that wasn't like a Freudian slip. Thanks everyone for being here. I am currently serving as the board chair for Kansas Interfaith Action. I've been effectively serving in that role since May, when our previous chair left a couple months earlier than expected, but it's still pretty new for me, and so I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today. Some of you are KIFA veterans, and for some of you it might be completely new. We're going to start off. I would like to introduce our executive director, Rabbi Moti Rieber. Moti was the executive director in the sort of precursor to KIFA when it was Kansas Interfaith Power and Light. And so you've seen Moti at previous in-person annual meetings of our conference and possibly in some other places as well. So he's been with us now for, is it 5 years? This is the 5th year, right? Or 6 years. We lose track of all the times. And adding to the authenticity of this gathering, Moti is in his booth outside celebrating the holiday of Sukkot, so he can talk a little bit more about that too if you want. Normally we get to join him there, and unfortunately this year that's not possible. But so we're going to talk a little bit about Kifa. I will let Moti begin. We'll give some background. For some of you, it may be review, but there are some new initiatives that we're implementing this year. And then we really hope to have some time for conversation at the end. And we are scheduled for an hour and a half, actually, not just an hour, which is a little bit different, but we understand, of course, that people may need to leave at 1. So of course, leave when you need to leave. Share your questions, in the chat. We'll try to get to them, and we can follow up with you outside of this meeting if you have to leave or if you have questions that are unanswered. So please continue, Moti, and then let me know when it's my turn to pipe up again.
All right, well, hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. I'm grateful to be with you. Wish it could be in person, but such is life these days. So I am in my sukkah for the Feast of Tabernacles, I guess. And we didn't get to have our gathering this year, but I've really been enjoying my sukkah this year because the weather's been beautiful. So I ran an Ethernet cord out to I have a wired sukkah, so it's been a lot of fun. And I've been doing all my meetings out here, so you may hear some chirping and air conditioning stuff going on, but hopefully that won't interfere too much. KIFA, so Kansas Interfaith Action, KIFA, KIFA, is coming to the end of its 5th year in this iteration. So we were established under this name in 2016. I actually became the director of Kansas Interfaith Power and Light in 2011, so I'm coming up to my 10th year. Although my first legislative badge was in 2013, I think. Sometimes I have trouble remembering that. I'm going to share my screen. If I can figure out where I'm going here. Oops. Okay. All right, so Sheridan, since you're the only person I can see that I know, you have to send me good vibes during my presentation, okay? Aside from Rachel, but Rachel's on duty. Let's see here. That's not good. That's what I want, not sharing. Okay, here we go. All right. So we start off with a little ground setting. I'm sure, as you're aware, that faith leaders and faith communities have had a huge impact on social justice movements throughout American history. So how many people recognize people in this picture aside from Aside from Martin, who do you recognize in this picture? Go ahead and unmute yourself and tell me who you recognize.
Daniel Berrigan, right?
Yeah, Daniel Berrigan. Yeah. And Malcolm, of course, and who else?
Dorothy Day.
Dorothy Day. And what about the fellow on the left? Any history buffs? That's William Lloyd Garrison. He was a very famous abolitionist before the Civil War. He was probably the most hated man in America at one point. He was the one who said, "My voice will be heard." And now I'm gonna let Rachel handle this part of it.
So we, one of the unique things about KIFA as a statewide multi-issue advocacy organization is that we are faith-based. We're the only group that is faith-based. There are some other multi-issue groups, and there are a lot of single-issue groups that we work with, but we're the only one that brings the voice of faith into the State House in a more comprehensive way. And one of the reasons that we started doing that was because the voice of faith is represented, or was represented frequently in the State House, but it was represented as a very homogenous, very far right voice. And so KIFA was born in part out of a desire to come back to that, to respond to that voice with a more pluralistic, multi-faith, and even demonstrating often that within one faith group, there's more than one voice. And so a part of that, those roots in faith communities and communities of conscience is that we are speaking always out of a tradition of sacred story and sacred scripture. And some of those scriptures we share, of course, and some of them are unique to each of our individual faith communities or confessions. But we think it's important to kind of set the grounding, and this is sort of like old hat in the UCC, right? So we have these, for some groups, this is some of the first times that they've read these scriptures in the Bible. And it's difficult, as you know, to narrow it down to just a couple. And so we look to Isaiah, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression. Proverb 31, open your mouth for the mute. That's this is often one of the texts that we turn to. Open your mouth and defend the rights of the poor and needy. So it's not just about doing works of charity, but about speaking for those who can't speak. And then there are so many more, but moving from the extensive witness of the prophets, we particularly like to call on this verse from Luke 4, where Jesus identifies himself in Luke's gospel, his first true public ministry appearance, by placing himself in the tradition of the prophets, by quoting the scripture from Isaiah and saying, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. I'm here to do this. He doesn't need to come up with new words. He sees himself as a part of this prophetic faith tradition. And then a controversial choice, perhaps, because we also have relationships with Lutheran churches, who you may know are Martin Luther was a little bit uncertain about whether James should be left in the canon. But nevertheless, we like James, even though he says faith without works is dead. He was more of a works and less of a grace kind of a person by some interpretations. This is such a great selection because it really speaks to the idea of thoughts and prayers, right? If thoughts and prayers are not enough, what good is it if you say to somebody, go in peace and stay warm and have a nice meal, if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. And so James talks about putting faith into practice and faithful action. And that really is essentially KIFA's motto, putting our faith into action. And then going on from there, of course, we mentioned Matthew's Great Commission, caring for those who are hungry, thirsty, a stranger, naked, sick, or in prison. When Christians are doing this, we have this theology of, whoever we care for, we're caring for Christ in that person. And we look for ways to extend a little bit outside of the faith traditions that we represent. KIFA is 90% Christian representation, because Kansas is the primary religious group in Kansas is Christian. So we do have members of our community who come from other faiths, Unitarian, Buddhist, Jewish, and Muslim. It's a lot smaller, and we would like to see more participation, and we're constantly reaching out and building those relationships. But it's still important, even when we're not here representing ourselves or having partners from our Muslim neighbors representing themselves with us, we try to share and always be learning from those sacred traditions too. So this is one of the sayings. The hadiths are the sayings that were believed to have been spoken from the Prophet Muhammad, that were written down. These are considered to be authentic, and they are authoritative in the canon of the Islamic faith. And one of them is this from Imam al-Bukhari, book 46, chapter 4. Allah's messenger says, "Help your brother whether he is an oppressor or he is an oppressed one." People asked, "Oh, Allah's messenger, it's all right to help him if he's oppressed, but how should we help him if he is an oppressor?" And the prophet said, "By preventing him from oppressing others." And that speaks so much also to the witness of Kifa, and I think is a great connection to how we see a lot of our work in the UCC, particularly the racial justice work that we're committed to. And that's been another important new focus for Kifa that we'll hear about more in this presentation.
That one's very timely. Okay, so Kifa's mission statement is that we are a statewide multi-faith issue advocacy group that works on a variety of racial, economic, and climate justice issues. Our slogan, as Rachel pointed out, is putting faith into action, and we perceive ourselves as filling a gap in Kansas politics that were tens of thousands of people of faith in Kansas who were not represented by the way faith was being represented in the State House. So I started off. This organization started off as an interfaith power and light chapter, and we realized that there was a need to have a broader mission than that, because there wasn't anybody else doing that kind of work. So since I had spent 5 years traveling the state talking about climate change, we felt that was a gap that we could fill. So in the beginning of 2016, we reincorporated as Kansas Interfaith Action, and we've been working on that under that name ever since. And our mission is based on what we call the 4 evils, which is based on Dr. King's 3 evils. In the Riverside Church speech, he talked about militarism, racism, and poverty and materialism. We expanded that to racism, discrimination, economic injustice, violence, particularly gun violence, and climate disruption. So anything that happens in the State House legislatively under any of those 4 categories, we will get involved with. And these are just some examples of stuff that we either are working on currently or have worked on recently in each of these categories. Criminal justice reform. Decarceration is a new way that we're framing this. We define it as the purposeful releasing of people from an overcrowded prison system. We think that's the way to talk about, the conversation on the streets and across the country is about defunding the police, but we think the way to have that conversation in a purposeful way in Kansas is to talk about taking money from the prison system. And to discontinue relying on prisons to deal with all of our social problems. And then voting rights and citizen engagement, poverty. Medicaid expansion has been a huge issue for us for several years now. We can talk about that more extensively in the discussion if you want to. Adequately funded safety net, a fair taxation system, living wage, minimum wage. Payday loan reform is something that we've worked on over the I guess last year was the first year we'd worked on that, but we're part of a coalition, statewide coalition working on payday loan reform. And then we've also been working on responses to the pandemic in terms of job protections and rental relief, primarily. Common sense gun reform is something that we've been working on since we became Kifa. Guns violence is a public health crisis, and it affects primarily white states through an increase in the suicide rate, which we're seeing a lot of in rural. I don't know if anybody read the book Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. It talks about this quite a bit, actually, Medicaid expansion and gun violence. And there's of course of course, there's a problem with gun violence in cities, but there's also a problem, almost a silent problem, in rural areas of suicides, which are much more effective when you use a gun. And then also domestic violence and sexual violence, we see a large increase in the use of guns in these crimes as well. And one of the more achievable gun reforms, we believe, is to actually something that has passed was taking guns out of the hands of domestic violence violators. And I think that there's the next stage of that is a red flag law, which would allow a court to order somebody to surrender their guns if they perceive to be a threat to themselves or to others. And then climate disruption, something that we hold very, we consider a core element of our mission. We are advocating for a rapid transition to a clean energy economy and to build resilience to the changes that are already into the pipeline, into our planning. Climate disruption is a justice issue because, as with all injustices, the people who get hurt worst and first are poor people and people of color. And that's both internationally and in our own countries. And I believe that what we're seeing with COVID, a lot of what we're seeing with COVID is what we will see with climate change, including resistance to effective measures, but xenophobia, incipient violence, or the inability of the society to deal with the problem, which we have seen with climate already, but I think we're seeing it playing out faster with COVID, but exactly the same dynamics. So how do we make our voices heard on these important decisions that affect everybody's life? And the way that we, as KIFA, do that is through advocacy. And advocacy means trying to have an effect on legislation on the state level. Now, there's different ways to make change. There's electoral work, there's demonstrations, there's community organizing, there's many different channels to make effective change. We feel our niche is advocacy, which is state public policy. So we organize in and through communities of faith to bring an effective voice on these issues into the state politics, into state the legislative process. I am a registered lobbyist. I like to say that my client is God, and I am on the ground during the legislative session, speaking to legislators, testifying. I'll get into that a little bit more. But the way I want to frame this right now is to say that we have a strategic partnership with the KO conference. We feel that we are your voice. Like we don't feel that. I mean, we actually are your voice. We have a direct relationship with the conference, and you can feel that your church, that your conference has representation in Topeka, a lobbyist essentially in Topeka, to bring your values forward. That's our mission. That's our goal. That's what we do. We work most effectively in coalitions, and these are all. Every time I make a list of the things that we do, I'm actually pretty impressed at the breadth of what we work on. These are all active coalitions. We find that because of our small size and our niche positioning as the faith voice, that it's most effective for us to be part of larger coalitions that have more resources. So for instance, in the Medicaid expansion, we're like the faith voice of the Medicaid Expansion Alliance. So if somebody needs somebody in a collar to come to a press conference, or we want to do, in February, we did a Medicaid expansion Sabbath, where 20 congregations talked about Medicaid expansion from the pulpit. That has a particular kind of resonance in the political system and in the public eye. So that's our role. That's what we do. And all of these, voting rights and climate and energy, are all active coalitions that we're working on now. We don't find it effective that we're not really in a position to be able to run legislation by ourselves. We've tried it a couple of times, and it doesn't really go very far because we need the breadth of everybody working on the same issues. And then in partnerships, we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but we have these relationships with these with judicatories, we're a strategic partner of the KO conference. and we're a state public policy office of the local synod of the ELCA. We're growing partnerships. These are not like as formal as the other ones, but the Episcopal Diocese, the Northern Presbytery, and the State Conference of the NAACP are all in various stages of establishing formal relationships. So when we have this workshop again next year, those 3 bullet points at the bottom will go to the top, God willing. And we take a lot of inspiration from the work of Reverend Barber. He was a direct model for us, especially at the beginning of the organization. And he says a moral agenda must be anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative, and deeply rooted and built within a fusion coalition. He also says that the policies that we're advocating for are not left or right, but morally centered. So, which is another quote that we like. So what does advocacy mean? Advocacy means taking an active involvement in the legislative process. And that means building relationships with legislators, testifying on bills, action alerts, meaning sending out, when something's coming to the floor or has a committee vote or something, we'll send out an alert to our supporters for them to either call or to email their legislators about whatever issue it is. We participate or sponsor, I think it wasn't last year, because last year a couple of them got canceled, but the previous year it was 5 legislative lobby days that we either sponsored ourselves or co-sponsored. Pay to Loan is one, citizen reform, criminal justice reform, climate and energy, and then we have a Kifa Day, which is a specific one for us to bring our supporters in. This one got canceled last year because this year it got canceled because it was the week that the legislature adjourned early. And then sometimes things are called, if the process doesn't work, sometimes more direct action is called for, and we've done a couple of direct action type things, usually under some of our partners' flags rather than our own. But we had a clergy kind of sing-in for Medicaid expansion a couple of years ago, and then there was also an action on the Senate, outside the Senate chambers this past year. We've also been involved in Poor People's Campaign stuff, but that's not necessarily under Kifa's rubric. We bring people to Topeka. I believe that it's really important to have people come to the Capitol. It's a kind of a closed system, so legislators will only see lobbyists a lot of the time. They won't necessarily have direct interaction with the people. So having people coming in steadily, 5 lobby days in essentially a 3-month legislative session is a lot of, bringing people in. And I think I like that part of the job, because I think that's a really important part of the system. So the one on the top left was right before our sing-in. Cynthia Meyer right there in front. And then this was the one on the right is Muslim Advocacy Day we did a couple of years. And then the one on the bottom left is a gun. That's a Moms Demand Action Day, but I believe it's a hearing on a gun bill. And then the rest of the time, so the legislative session in Kansas is from January to May essentially, and then the rest of the year, in a normal year, I travel the state, giving sermons and workshops and meeting people in the field and doing kind of grassroots organizing. Mostly in areas that are sort of the second-tier cities, I would say, like Salina, Hutchinson, Emporia, like that kind of. Any place where there's a Regents University that tends to be where there's liberal Christians. So Lidsborg, I've been to several times. There's a university there. That's generally the places where we'll find the best response. We also have a flagship program called the Faith and Public Policy Forum, which we've done every year since 2016. It's a panel discussion with some of our colleagues and partners to talk about whatever we think the issues are that are facing next year's legislature. So it's usually tax and budget, criminal justice reform, Medicaid expansion, like all the things that we work on. But it's like an issues forum. Churches sometimes have candidate forums. Well, this is an issues forum. And in the past, we've traveled to the state, around the state, and done them in different locations. This year, we did it as a webinar on Facebook Live in late August. And actually, I thought it was probably our most successful one. You go to Salina and you try really hard to get 50 people in the room, but we did it online once and we got over 1,000 views. So I mean, I think there's sometimes, you're probably understanding this from the church point of view, these things that we're doing for the inconvenience or for the emergency are actually some of them will actually keep once the emergency is over. And the use of digital organizing will definitely be one of them for us, because we're a small statewide organization. I can't be everywhere, nor should I be. So working with digital media, working with digital platforms is really an important part of where we need to go. New projects, Rachel alluded to this earlier. We have 2 new working groups. One is a racial justice working group, which is co-chaired by Reverend Robert Johnson, who's a United Methodist pastor in Wichita, and a climate justice working group, which is co-chaired by the Episcopal Bishop Kathleen Bascom and an ELC pastor in Topeka named Jenny Jackson. These are groups that, again, figuring out ways to expand our reach, to use volunteers effectively, particularly clergy. The Racial Justice Working Group is a little bit further along. There's an active group of about 10 to 12 people. We're doing a program, which I'll get to in a second, starting next week. The Climate Justice Working Group is a little further back. We're still in the organizational stage there. But if you are interested in being in KIFA's Climate Justice Working Group, it's basically to help decide what the priorities, what our advocacy priorities would be, and also to do outreach, specifically on the climate, in the climate sphere. If this is something that calls to you, you'd like to get involved in something like this, and you're willing to attend some meetings, please let me or Rachel know, because we do want to build this group up to be similar to the Racial Justice Working Group, to have a group of about 10 to 12 people working on this. A couple of new, I don't want to go into too much detail on these, but our partners, the Climate and Energy Project in the climate space, have joined a regional network called REAMP, which is about decarbonization. Equitable decarbonization is the catchphrase, so it's very catchy, don't you think? And this is a Midwest states, very similar to ours, working on similar issues. So this is a brand new thing. They just announced it. We're part of the coalition, and we're really looking forward to kind of a new era in our climate work. And then we've just signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with Kansas Action for Children. We're going to be working on some of their economic justice priorities. Primarily, they work on fair taxation and budget, but also making sure that the social safety net works, which is a big problem in Kansas because actually it doesn't work. So addressing that. One of the things about we can talk a little bit more about specific issues in the question and answer period, but one of the things that I think about, and it kind of goes back to the decarceration conversation, is if we have budget cuts necessitated by a tax revenue decrease caused by the pandemic and the recession, what's going to get cut? And what usually gets cut in such situations is exactly the things that we need to prevent people from going to prison. Social workers and education and activities and all kinds of stuff like that, mental health care, substance abuse treatment. And what doesn't get cut is the prison corrections budget. So we can't let that happen. We can't say that this budget, which we know is too big, if we have too many people in prison, everybody knows that, but we can't treat that budget as sacrosanct to the exclusion of these important issues, social needs that are not being funded hardly at all in Kansas. Okay, The role of faith communities. Why is it important for faith communities to be involved in this work? We have moral language. We started off this conversation with presentations of texts that we hold dear, that give us a mission statement, that gives us meaning. We believe that these books mean what they say about caring for the poor and caring for the less fortunate and caring for the immigrant. Social capital is built by faith communities. We're in the social capital business. Connections amongst people, between people, and in communities. Even in a time when church population is down, churches still have an important role to play in their communities in building community connection. I believe that one of the big problems with our society is how we've been picked apart, and all the things that we used to do that brought us together have been defunded or eliminated. This is the bowling alone syndrome. Churches are in the business of building those community connections, and that is something that almost only they do. Building the interfaith beloved community. I believe that meaningful change cannot be, and Kiefer's model is, that meaningful change cannot be built by one faith community, by one social justice committee in one church, that we need to build beyond our borders, beyond our walls, to bring everybody who shares these same values across the spectrum together in meaningful collective effort. That's what Kiefer's model is. And then the other piece is, tikkun is a Hebrew word. It means repair. So you may have heard, if you're familiar with it, you may have heard the word tikkun olam. So tikkun olam means repair of the world. So tikkun means a repair of the damage done by right-wing religion. Because I believe that this model of intolerance and xenophobia that right-wing Christianity has put forward damages religion itself. I actually believe it's a violation of the commandment against taking God's name in vain. But by modeling, people don't really realize that there's an alternative. You might be surprised to learn that people don't always realize that there's an alternative way of being Christian or of being religious. That this is actually authentically, in some ways more authentically, more authentic role for religion to play, as we talked about when we were talking about Martin Luther King and William Lloyd Garrison. And then also on a personal level, I have this thing called the three-legged stool of faith development, which is personal religious practice, spiritual practice, which is Christians call salvation, mission work, which Christians are very good at, bombing the wounds, ameliorating the harm done. But that's a lot of times where people stop. They don't realize that the third leg of the stool is social justice. So where mission work cleans up the riverbank, social justice looks back upriver to see why it's polluted in the first place and attempts to address root causes. That's what we're doing, and that's the role that we play. And unfortunately, a lot of churches don't even see that as an authentic part of their mission. The UCC, I don't think, has that problem. But it requires to be reinforced a lot that this is actually, you can't be a full person of faith, a fully developed, fully realized person of faith without all three of these aspects of your faith. Okay, and now I'm going to stop talking and let Rachel talk here for a moment.
So one of the questions that we get sometimes is why do we need a lobbyist in Topeka? Why would the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference want to support a lobbyist? I think even sometimes among more progressive people, like lobbyist is kind of a bad word. Lobbyists are the people who are scamming the system and ruining our democracy by, putting business interests at work. And that's sort of true. And that's why we need a lobbyist also in Topeka. And this is true in Oklahoma as well, that in states that are dominated by a particular kind of conservative, right-wing, Republican or Tea Party coalition, to be heard at all, to be in the room at all. And even in fact, to learn which room to be in, you have to have a lobbyist on the ground. And we don't love that. We don't love that the system has fallen into that kind of a practice. But it's even sometimes the situation of, we will have planned to be at the Capitol on a certain day at a certain time to give testimony for a certain piece of legislation. And those meetings will be moved deliberately at the last second to a different time and a different location to make it more difficult for the people who are supposed to testify. I'm just reading Harry Potter 5 with my kids, and it's like the same situation, right? So having the lobbyists there gives us this kind of strategic presence that's not just about, all of the, we want to buy our way in or compete with other groups. It's really a situation of, if we want to be able to be effectively heard in our state capital, it's very difficult to do as a lone individual, working from home, or if you don't have that real expertise, connections. Moti will get calls from legislators or other lobbyists who will say, hey, that thing you were supposed to do is now going to be in this other place at this other time, so make sure you're here. And having that kind of support is really essential for some of the ways that we have been able to inch forward on some of the issues that matter to us. Our legislators who are sympathetic to the work that we do have told us, we need you. We need your help. You give us the language we need to be able to respond when other legislators or administrators say, Christians in Kansas want X. All Christians in Kansas support don't want to support a strong, prison system. And then these other legislators can say, well, the people of faith who are more than just Christians who I'm talking to interpret their faith in a very different way. And so it's that kind of fighting with fire response that we're able to do. And of course, any individual from any church in the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference can contact your legislator anytime and say those things. But there is a difference when we actually have people on the ground in Topeka or in Oklahoma City. And there is still a difference, and many of you know this already, in both of these states, when it is clergy, when it is religiously identified leaders, because our legislators still have a sense that even though churches may not have exactly the same kind of influence that we used to have in politics at all levels, in our states, there is still a sense that, religious leaders are speaking to a larger community of constituents. They have influence. When religious leaders get together and do a direct action like the sing-in, the optics of arresting a bunch of clergy don't look very good. So sometimes we're able to get away with doing a little bit more. So we're using the system, even when we don't completely agree with every aspect of how things are working. We can want that to change, and we can work for that to change. But meanwhile, Kifa is always working, and Moti is such a great leader for us in working to find that middle place between this vision that we hold and the reality of what we are working with, and responding to that reality as it is, even as we hope to change the narrative to a different approach to how politics works in our state. So in this strategic partnership with the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference, Kifa gets from the conference financial support and outreach support, meaning we get like communications. We can send out messages, we can put articles in the e-news, we can be in places like this annual meeting to continue to share information about what we're doing and ways that you can get involved. So that's one of the main ways that the conference supports us, that and an annual gift to support Kifa's operations. Then there's this sort of middle space where we are effectively a network. We're this networking space, and because we are a United Church of Christ, we're composed of individual congregations, right? We don't even have associations anymore. So we don't have these middle judicatories. And even our statewide conference judicatory doesn't have authority. As we were discussing with Eleanor about the synod in Germany, we don't have the authority to say, here's the curriculum, you guys do it, or here's the advocacy issues, you guys follow up on these. But what we find is that while not every congregation in Kansas or Oklahoma has a social justice committee or an advocacy committee or some kind of official relationship with advocacy from that congregation, essentially every congregation that we have been in touch with or heard from has at least one or two people And often that might be all they have, especially in a smaller church. There's one or two people who say, this is important, this work matters to me, I want us to be more involved, I want our church to be more involved, but I don't have the resources, the time, the energy, the congregational commitment to make this advocacy work a centerpiece or a primary mission of our congregation. And so we see Kifa as having a beneficial role for judicatories like Kansas, Oklahoma, to say, send us your people, send us those 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 people from your congregation, because this is a way for, instead of creating a committee in every single congregation, this is a way for people to kind of build that work through this resource, working through Kifa, sharing, what's going on, using Kifa's educational resources, and using the network that Kifa creates to say, here's when we need you in the State House, here's the day you need to contact your legislator. And then you can share that back out to your churches without having to kind of lead and invent all of that work on your own. And then we also have this, between the statewide and then the networking around the state, we also are available when it's appropriate to do events at local churches. So we are speakers who will go out or join virtually churches of any size. It's not only large churches. We've had very small churches, we essentially do pulpit supply. And so we get support for Kifa in the form of like a one Sunday pulpit supply. And we come and we speak about Kifa's work. We've done like adult Bible study or adult Sunday school conversations. We do training about how to do advocacy. We've hosted other small events at local churches. So sometimes a congregation will invite us in and host an event that they invite other people to. And it may be one of those faith and public policy forums that we've previously done by traveling around the state. It might be an advocacy training. It might be more of an educational, why should people of faith do advocacy? Sometimes that's really more of the starting point in some of our churches. So we're available to come to you, and we also would like you to come with us into the State House. And the idea of doing that in Kansas and in Oklahoma is that it's kind of it's like a gateway into more action. Once you've done it first, it can be very intimidating. I was very intimidated to walk into the State House the first day. But once you've done it, it's not that big of a deal. Once you get through it the first time, once you walk into the first legislator's door and they're not mean to you typically. The worst thing that'll happen is their secretary will tell you they're not available, and you know that the secretary is lying because you just saw them walk in and you can see that they're available. But, so they just say, oh, they're not available. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Here's a postcard of what I would like to say to that person. So I think that there is this, Kifa sees ourselves as kind of ushering people through that first stage of, come in, see that you can do this, and hopefully people will continue, not only with Kifa, but with lots of other kinds of advocacy as well. Oops. Other way. Just briefly, as we wrap up, to sort of root ourselves in the UCC broader history. We talk about how we go to different religious groups and we have to explain, why we do advocacy, that even advocacy is part of our faith tradition. And in the UCC, we don't really have to explain that, right? Advocacy is who we are, and it's who we've been from the beginning. But in particular, there was a resolution at the 11th General Synod in 1977 that really outlined a specific vision of advocacy as citizen education, political organizing, public hearings, the idea that to be a church that is actively engaged in prophetic ministry means that we are doing work in advocacy with our government. And if you can go to the next slide, Moti, I think there's some really good language for this on the UCC advocacy page, talking about how, government in and of itself isn't always the best instrument to deal with injustice. And we are absolutely seeing that right now on multiple issues, but especially around systemic racism in our country. But it is an institution that is, in some estimations, created by God as part of God's providence for the welfare of the people. So because we live in a democracy, in other words, a government of the people, we have not only the ability or the right, but the privilege and the responsibility to use the power of our citizenship to promote public justice. This is the system that we're in, so it's the system that we as people of faith can use to speak up. And as Moti alluded to, when the system doesn't work, we don't just speak up through the system, we also try to work around the system or demonstrate against the system. And all of those things have to kind of happen together. So I think that's it. What's the next slide, Moti? That's kind of like the UCC background. And so we want to talk a little bit about how you can get involved with KIFA. You can sign up for our email list. I put that link in the chat earlier. You can follow us on social media. You can support us financially, where KIFA has some grant support and a couple of major donors, but we are primarily a network of grassroots financial support from small donors, and every little bit makes a big difference. You can also invite us to do citizen advocacy training with you in your congregation. You can join hopefully some kinds of citizen lobby days that we'll be re-envisioning as virtual events in the coming year. And then when we do have direct action, we send that out through our action alerts as well. I see there's a question, and I know we'll have more time for questions later, but there's a question from Rosemary about what about an Oklahoma one? So there are different Oklahoma coalitions, and there's the Oklahoma Council of Churches, which I think maybe someone else who's here from Oklahoma can speak to that in our discussion. There are multiple coalitions in Oklahoma that are doing very similar kinds of work, although I don't think any of them are structured exactly the same way as KIFA, but we would definitely like to open up in the conversation if there are people here from Oklahoma who can share, what's the similar kind of connection in Oklahoma.
Okay, just a couple of upcoming events, and then we're really coming to the end of this. We have clergy calls once a month. So that's an opportunity for people to come on a call. We spend about 10 minutes talking about what's coming up immediately, KIFA, or where we are on the issues that we're working on if it's during the legislative session. And then we have a guest to talk about their work. In the past, Sister Simone Campbell's been on the call. We've had a number of kind of different people on the call, national people and also local. Tend to focus more locally during the legislative session and then try to learn from that people working on the national level during the rest of the year. So next week we have one on Tuesday, the 13th. He's a faith and public policy fellow. It's not exactly his title, but he's a fellow at the Center for American Progress. And then Stan Cox from the Land Institute has a new book about the Green New Deal in November. And then Robin Henderson Espinoza, who is a queer theologian. She has a book and a podcast called Activist Theology, and that's our lineup for the rest of the year. We have 3 virtual voter engagement events coming up for the next 3 consecutive Thursdays, not today, but starting next week. Half an hour sessions to try to encourage younger people to vote mostly. And that'll be live streamed on the KIFA Facebook page. So KIFA has a Facebook page. If you just Google or Facebook, whatever, Kansas Interfaith Action, you'll find it. We're in the early stages of talking about an Election Day prayer vigil because we think the country's going to need a lot of praying. Thoughts and prayers might be really well suited for that day. So stay tuned for that. And then also we'll do post-mortem, post-game analysis of the election, and then preparing for the next legislative session. Those haven't been established yet in terms of when they'll be, but if you get on KIFA's, if you subscribe to KIFA's Facebook page or get on our email list, you'll get information. It's helpful if you tell me that you're clergy, because then we can code you that way in the system, and you can be sure to get whatever we send out to clergy, which is not always the same. And this is our contact information. KansasInterfaithAction.org. I'm also M. Rieber, I before E, at KansasInterfaithAction.org, or Kifa at KansasInterfaithAction.org, KIFA, that's our email address, or on Twitter. So that's the end of the slides. I will stop the sharing and we can open up for questions and discussion. And feel free to unmute yourself and see if there's anything in the chat. All right, Edith put some stuff in about Oklahoma into the chat. You don't want to listen to me talking for another 20 minutes, so say something.
Well,
One of the questions we've had a lot recently is, what do we think the issues are going to be next year? And every time we ask our legislators, they're like, we'd love to know. We'd love to know if there's going to be a session and what that's going to look like. So they don't really have a response yet. And of course, until after the election, we won't know exactly. We are not, I would say, and Moti, you can be more specific about this. We are not super optimistic about can care expansion in the coming year. And that may be an issue that a lot of people here are familiar with and have worked on and have questions about. So do you want to maybe share a little bit about what do we think could happen in the coming year?
Well, I mean, I think the issues that we'll be talking about are the same issues that we would be talking about one way or the other. I mean, we have this additional issue of the budget and how will we respond to any budget decline caused by COVID and the recession. And that depends on if there's ever a stimulus package that includes budget relief for states. I mean, there's a lot of ifs. There is certainly going to be a legislative session next year. There's no question about that. I think the question is, well, there's two questions. The COVID question is, who's going to be allowed in the building? When we did the special session, only the registered lobbyists were allowed in the building. So we're going to have to figure out some way to do virtual. I believe we're going to have to figure out some way to do virtual advocacy days. I think that's almost certainly going to be the case. I don't see a situation where we're going to be so out of the woods on COVID that there's just going to be, everybody's going to be allowed to come into the, everybody's either going to want to, whether they're allowed to or not. So we're going to need to figure out some way to address that. The likelihood of success on different issues depends on how the election comes out. And I am very focused on down ballot, what we call down ballot races. So everybody's always distracted by the shiny object of the presidential election. And in this case, we have a Senate election. In Kansas, we have a Senate election that's very competitive. But what's important for us is the down ballot races, is state legislative races, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And if you are doing voter encouragement in your pulpits, then I would remind people that the lower down the ballot the race is, the more it directly affects their lives. There's always a lot of skepticism, especially amongst progressives, about whether elections really help. We're in a red state, and sometimes it doesn't seem like they do. But I can tell you from personal experience that the difference between Medicaid expansion and not Medicaid expansion is one or two people. That on that case, I don't know what happens in Washington, but I know that in Topeka, the difference between, one pro Medicaid expansion person or the difference between having a climate denier in a position of power and having a climate champion in a position of power, or even in a minority position, is profound. It just changes the whole conversation. We have a good governor. She has 2 years until re-election. It'd be nice to have a legislature that wanted to work with her. That's kind of the goal. So don't forget about down ballot races. I think that's really important. And I think that I agree with Rachel's. I'm probably the one who gave it to her, but I agree with Rachel's pessimism about care expansion, because I think that it's likely that there's going to be the Senate president, the leadership is going to be somebody who opposes it. But there's still other things that we could be working on. Criminal justice reform plays both ways, cuts across partisan lines in some ways. Payday loan reform cuts across partisan lines. Criminal justice reform I mentioned. Clean energy cuts across partisan lines. Not necessarily calling it climate change, but clean energy policy cuts across partisan lines. So from that point of view, you have to figure out who's there and what their interests are. But I will say that at this stage, a month out from the election, the better results we get from the down ballot races, the better off we'll be next year.
I want to point out that we also have Linda Thurston on the Zoom call, and she is also on the board of Kansas Interfaith Action, another UCC person. And Mike Muntz, I thought I saw Mike at one time, maybe by phone, is also on the board of Kansas Interfaith Action.
Yeah,
so we've
there.
got a little, there he is. We've got a little UCC ringleader group happening here. And I wanted to ask, and Linda, you might have something to speak to on this, or anyone here. If you are familiar with KIFA, or if you've ever been involved or utilized any of KIFA's resources, what is helpful for your congregations, or what would you like to see? What would be helpful maybe that you haven't found, or resources that either we haven't developed or we have developed, but we just haven't done as good of a job of sharing them. How do you see KIFA as being a supportive resource for your congregations?
I'll talk about that for just a little bit. I'm from Manhattan. I'm one of the lay people on the board of KIFA. And one of the things that I have found about KIFA that's really been important to me and to the congregation that I take all the messages back to, and Moti has visited us many times, is that it gives us a language. And especially lay people sometimes don't have the language we need. We just say, well, of course we should have clean energy. Well, of course they shouldn't have discrimination and incarceration. Well, of course they, but we don't, we just do it because, we can't say, well, I believe this because I learned it in Sunday school. We need to have the language to talk about it to each other and to our congregations, and then to people in our communities, and then when we go do advocacy work at the legislature. So I think the combination of the depth of especially the 4 big issues that we're working on, and then the language to go with it that we can use to replace the "because God said so" when we talk about, I think, are a big contribution from KIFA that have helped a lot of people.
Although secretly I'm a big fan of "because God said so." That's why we start with the Bible quotes.
This is Bill Brown. Can you turn that off, Pat? Pat and I are sitting at the same table, and so I'm hearing my own voice coming back at me. We're representing Rolling Hills UCC in Salina, and Rabbi, you and I have met before on a couple of occasions. I used to belong to an anti-poverty advocacy group, and to a certain extent, our whole church was involved, called Results. I don't know whether you're familiar with Results or not, but we suffered a great deal of frustration. Several of us who were here in Salina meeting with that group by distant means, because our letters were rarely received by any means other than form letters, which would often mistake or simply ignore what we were really saying about sustaining the credits for people living near poverty and issues of that kind. I'm wondering whether the means that KIFA offers differ as to the influence upon legislators. There's certainly an advantage in dealing with the state rather than the national representatives whom we rarely had a chance to see face to face, but did once in a while. We attended their sessions when they would visit local venues. And even there, we were curiously marginalized.
So, thank you for the question. So in the specific case of Salina, it's been very interesting because you have, if you're in the district that I think you're in, you've had a very conservative representative and a moderate senator. So, I can't say many of us live in Kansas, live in areas where we're very frustrated by our representation. I mean, there's just no question about that. I mean, those of us who live in Kansas are frustrated by our representation all the time because our senators have been who they are. I happen to live in Johnson County, so I have a better, but in any case, in the state legislative process, you've had. So I wouldn't say in that case that the opposition to your positions are implacable because your moderate senator was open to conversation. There's a legislator in Assyria who is very powerful because he's the chair of the Senate of the House Tax Committee, and he purports to be a moderate, even though you wouldn't always know that from his voting record. In this election, you're going to have that conservative representative is now going to be your senator, so I wouldn't have much hope there. But there is a competitive election for that House seat, so you might end up in a situation where, instead of having some possible influence on the senator, now you'll have some possible influence on the representative. So I think there's always an angle, even if to say that, going to their public events, if they have them, and saying, you're not listening to us. This is the time of year where if you have energy to spend, you should spend it on trying to elect people who would more accurately represent your interests. But I also think that in most cases, well, in a lot of cases, not most cases, I mean, if you live west of Salina, you're going to have a hard time with this. Although there's moderates out there too, depending on the issue, as I said. But there's if you if you come to me and you say, this is my legislator, and what do I talk to him about? And I can say, you're not going to get anywhere on this issue, but you may get somewhere on this issue. And maybe that's what, you're not going to get anywhere on poverty relief, but you may get somewhere on clean energy. That's just a random example. I'm not speaking about your person specifically in that case. Or you could go and try to have some influence on the guy from Assyria. Targeting your efforts based on the possible influenceability of your legislator, as I just coined a word, maybe your best tactic. I think that even if you are in super right wing territory and you're never going to get anywhere with any of your people, there's a rabbinic saying that I hold very close at times like this, which is, it's not upon you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. There are people who are in need, even if it's frustrating, even if we lose, those people are still in need. Even if we're older and tired, those people are still in need. And you need to, or maybe your role is to mentor younger people. That's also a possibility. That's a place where I'm getting in my life. So I think it's worth sort of thinking about this. This kind of tags back to the question about the three legs of faith development. If one of your legs is weak or frustrating, then it's worth talking to either your spiritual leader or one of us as your, mentors in social justice to figure out what the best angle is for you or what the best approach might be for you. It's a discernment process. And I think you're bringing up a very important issue because many of us have been through many years of being very frustrated by what's happened in Kansas. There's no question about that. But there's always something that we can do. I think there's always something that we can do. Thank you for your question. Hope that helped.
Thank you.
Hi, Sheridan. I see that Eleanor McCormick is on this call. Eleanor. Hello, Eleanor. Are you calling from Germany, Eleanor? Oh, she's not paying attention. I called her out. Uh-oh.
She's been chatting with me. She is calling, and she's been part of the annual meeting from all the way from Germany as well.
Must be the middle of the night. No, I guess not. It's probably 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock.
Yeah. Any other questions? We scheduled until 1:30, but we don't have to go until 1. To be available to you. We wanted to build in the extra time because sometimes an hour is really too short to do more in-depth questions. So if there are questions or other examples that you want to share of how you have used Kifa resources in your congregation, or what resources you think would be helpful that you haven't been able to access. Kelly Hansen, who is a chaplain in a really awesome program in Kansas City, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's gun violence survivors. It's a kind of multifaceted chaplaincy response team in the Kansas City area. Says, as a chaplain, how can I offer support since I don't have a church community to invite participation?
Well, sometimes people who are in non-pulpit settings actually have a lot more freedom because they don't have the politics of pissing off their donor or whatever might happen. Excuse my figurative language. But that happens all the time where people come to us and they say, I can't, what can I do? I'm in Kansas. I don't want to start a war in my church. And there's, we have answers for that too. But in this particular case, being a chaplain, especially a chaplain who's working on a direct issue that we're talking about, I mean, your stories would be very profound. And you don't have to worry about, the review process or whatever. So that actually gives you a little bit of freedom. But I would say that in your particular case, you being present as a person, as a leader, as a faith leader, as somebody who works in the field, the stories that you could tell would be very powerful. I would very much encourage you to let Rachel know where we can get in touch with you, because I think I would love to talk with you more.
I think especially also related to CanCare expansion, the more stories that we can hear from people who are witnessing to the on top of the medical trauma, the trauma of being in that place, and also being worried about, how am I going to pay for this? What am I going to do? I hope I get better, but also I don't know if I do hope I get better, because then I'm going to be bankrupted by the medical bills I know are piling up while I'm here. And so much of the testimony and the way that the legislation moves forward in our state house is very based in these personal stories, personal example, you would think it would be based on budgets and data and statistics, but it's not. It's people coming in and it's well, this side had the most good storytellers today, so I guess that's the direction we're going to vote. Or the Senate president told me if I don't vote this way, I'm not going to get any support on my next election. But those stories actually really do make a difference, and those stories are then the resources that the legislators who are working with us use to retell in their constituencies, to say, well, here's a story that might help you think about why I, a Republican, for example, am voting in this way, even though maybe you don't think this is a Republican issue, because here's a story you may not know. And your stories, Kelly, I think definitely are stories that could be heard in central and western Kansas and help some of those legislators be able to, even though I know you're technically in Missouri for your work, but you're working with people from Kansas and Missouri. Yeah, it's incredible how much those stories are really what drives a lot of the legislative process in the state.
We had a lot of doctors from KU Med who were working on us when we were working on Campus Carry, which was something that we lost. I think gun violence is probably the one that's most, going back to Bill's question, that the one that's been most frustrating for me on a personal level has been the inability to sort of get anywhere with gun violence, although this domestic violence bill did get passed. So sometimes you look back and you go, well, something got passed that I thought was like nothing, and it turned out to be pretty significant. Actually, that's usually the approach that we have to take, or that's often the approach that we have to take. But I'm just thinking about that because John Lennon's birthday is tomorrow, and I remember when he got, some of us are old enough to remember when he got killed, and there was a sort of a flowering of gun violence activism, also when after Reagan got shot and Brady and all that, and handgun activism, and that's gone by the wayside. We're way worse off than we were 25 years ago on guns. And it seems like the go-to divisive, not social justice, but socially divisive issue in races. But we, like I said, you got to do what you got to do, and we have to start from where we are and work with what we have, and hopefully every year we get more of a support for meaningful action on that issue. So I'd love to talk to you more about that. All right, I think that's good. I'm good to call it good if you are. Thank you so much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Please sign up. If you're not on our mailing list, please sign up on our mailing list. And if you feel so moved, please go to our website and make a donation. We would much appreciate it. And hopefully I'll see some of you next Tuesday on our call with Guthrie Fitzsimmons.
Thank you. Thank you, Moti and Rachel, for your time this afternoon. Hope you all have learned a lot about KIFA. And we will see many of you tonight, 7 o'clock, where we'll have the opportunity to hear Julian. I think you will enjoy him. He's great. So don't miss it. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.